Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Positive Planet webinar, Demystifying Life Cycle Assessments. This is part of Positive Planet's 6-part webinar series, Sustainability in Practice, Turning Strategy into Action. We're excited today to dive into the world of life cycle assessment, what it really is, why it matters, and how businesses like yours can use it to make smarter, more sustainable product decisions. But before we get started, here's a quick sort of introduction to who we are at Positive Planet for those of you who are new to us. So Positive Planet, we're a small team still with quite a big, friendly personality, we like to think. We're all about building connections with you as our clients and helping businesses to make real progress on sustainability. We work closely with our clients to really understand their goals, but also the people behind them too. So that we can tailor our support to what actually matters to you. So that might mean measuring your emissions, it might mean building a reduction plan, navigating ESG, or delivering accredited training. But we like to keep things practical, clear, understandable, and human as well, whilst minimising jargon, which is commonplace in the industry. So just providing you with the insight and the support that you actually need to turn your intentions into real impact. So today you have myself, Bryony, the Head of Sustainability, and Dr. Michael Kenyon, our Principal LCA Consultant, who will be leading today's webinar. Michael, do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself?
Thank you, Bryony. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Michael Kenyon. I am the Principal Lifecycle Assessment Consultant at Positive Planet. I have a long history of working as a sustainability analyst, delivering lifecycle assessments, environmental product declarations, and product carbon footprints, among other areas of sustainability as well. In a previous role, I also worked in the global metals and materials supply chain as a consultant, delivering these services. But my sustainability and materials background goes all the way back to my PhD in advanced metallic systems, which I did at the University of Manchester. And there I was looking to understand and improve the sustainability of automotive components. So as Bryony mentioned, today in this short session, I'm going to go through the what, why, and how of life cycle assessments, highlight some of the challenges through the project for the LCA practitioner, but also the opportunities and the future outlook for LCA as a method. I'll then start to discuss some of the key considerations if you're looking to do an LCA or PCF and you're new to the area, and I'll highlight some of the pricing and timescales considerations as well, and hopefully the next steps with Positive Planet. So let's dive in with an introduction and a definition of life cycle assessment.
And just before we do that, Michael, just to let everyone know, the session is being recorded, so you'll be able to revisit it later or share it with colleagues on YouTube from Wednesday. I think it's going to be live, but we'll also share the link with you via follow-up email. And we would love the session to be as interactive as possible. So if you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat, which you should see, I think, down there, this right of your screen. And share any experience that you might have had in LCA before and what you're hoping to get from today. We aim to finish up around 5 to 1, maybe a little bit later, but hopefully that gives us a few minutes for questions before the scheduled close. But because we're expecting so many people on today, we might be extending that a little bit further, maybe to 10 past 1. So do please stay on for that little bit longer if you can. But equally, you will have the recording afterwards. So you can catch up then if you do have to jump off. So please leave your questions in the chat and we will try to cover as many of those as we can at the end. And back over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Bryony. Yes, with the fact that we are going to be providing the slides and the recording, I have put a bit more text in these slides that I usually would do. So please don't worry about copying down all these notes. But as I said, let's start with an introduction and definition to life cycle assessment. What is it? So life cycle assessment is a structured, comprehensive and quantitative methodology used to measure the life cycle environmental impact of a product or service. And in that life cycle, we typically start at what's called the cradle. So in the figure on the left-hand side, that will be the raw materials extraction. Once we have those materials necessary for the final component, we of course then need to process, semi-fabricate, manufacture those input materials and other consumables into that final product or ready for delivery of that service. Now, in some studies, you might want to do what's called a cradle to gate, and we can set that gate traditionally where that manufacturing of that product ends. We then might want to incorporate the transportation, and of course, transportation is incurred throughout the life cycle of the product, but here we're really looking at the transportation to the final consumer. And then we have to look at the use phase and the end of life considerations. So end of life considerations being the disposal, either via traditional routes such as incineration or landfill, or we can look at the recycling and reuse of that material as well. And that would be the grave of the study. So we have cradle to grave and cradle to gate. You also might want to focus in on just one phase of that life cycle, and that will be called a gate to gate. Or you might even want to take that step further and look at a specific process, and you can do that again with what's called a gate to gate study. You may also see the term cradle to cradle, and this is really looking at a more circular economy and looking at reusing those materials within similar or the same applications that it has already been used. But the most common we see are cradle to grave and cradle to gate. Now, there are international standards that set the framework and underlying principles for conducting an LCA, which are the ISO 14040 and 14044 standards. So I've just done one slide on the difference between product carbon footprint and LCA. So product carbon footprint is exactly the same as an LCA, except it focuses only on greenhouse gas emissions, which of course is referring to the impact category of climate change. So it's often used for carbon reporting, reduction planning, and responding to customer or regulatory requirements. And there are specific standards around conducting product carbon footprint, ISO 14067, which have been built upon out of the ISO 14040 and 14044 standards. You might be more familiar with other standards for product carbon footprint, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Product Reporting Standard. And then you might be referring to the inputs and outputs in the more typical categories that you may have seen on the left-hand side, such as Scope 1, 2, and 3. So that's a very brief introduction to what LCA is and the difference between LCA and PCF. But why do we actually want to do an LCA? What is the benefit to the commissioners? Once we understand that environmental impact for that product or service, of course, we want to explore the ways to reduce that environmental impact as an overall objective for that study, whether that might be testing alternative materials, input consumables, or looking at making processes more efficient or the effect of more efficient processes, or even alternative processes. They're just a few items of a long list of solutions that can be embedded within the LCA to explore those environmental impact reductions. You might want to use LCA data to make smarter decisions within your business to align to your organizational sustainability goals. You might want to communicate that environmental information to your client base. An LCA is a comprehensive methodology, can help share clear, transparent, credible information with those customers. Within an LCA project, you're most likely going to engage with your supply chain to collect the necessary information and data for that product system that you're modeling. By doing that, you can actually help your supply chain understand and reduce their own contribution to that environmental impact, you might also be considering alternative suppliers, whether it's suppliers in a different region or suppliers that can produce a similar material with a lower embodied carbon or lower environmental impact. Indirectly, it can help highlight those reduction in business costs through optimizing processes or looking at reduction across the material section of the project. You can really assess where costs might start to influence as long as the environmental impact. There are already existing regulations that embed some of the principles of LCA or ask directly for environmental impact information. And more we're seeing LCA as a methodology embed these principles in future regulations that might be coming forward. And I've got an example of that later on. LCA can be used to help enhance that brand recognition and build trust with those stakeholders. It can help you stand out as a responsible business and support any sustainability claims that you might want to make. It can help you access innovation and funding, whether that's through direct investors or through governmental programs such as from UK Research and Innovation, Innovate UK. Those sorts of programs and funding calls are more and more looking to embed environmental information or LCA as a methodology to support those projects. But there are also support for bid submissions, whether that's public or private, for example, from local councils or other governmental tenders. So I've just highlighted there some of the high-level key reasons why you might want to do an LCA. Of course, that list is not exhaustive. But how do we actually then go about doing an LCA? As I've already mentioned, ISO 14040 and 14044 sets the framework and principles for conducting an LCA. Now, I could talk about each of these main phases of the project in quite a bit of detail, but really it's on the LCA practitioner to conduct this study. So I'll just give you a high-level overview of these four main phases that are required to conduct an LCA, starting from the goal and scope definition. So the goal and scope qualitatively describes the objectives of the study, how you're intending to use the results, but also the methodological decisions on how to conduct that LCA. Once we've done the goal and scope, we then move into the life cycle inventory phase. This is the data collection part of the study and typically the most time-consuming part because both the commissioners and the LCA practitioners need to collect that primary data, but also the background and secondary data to fulfill all the inputs and outputs for the entire system. Once we've collected that data, we then need to convert that into the set of environmental impact categories of interest, such as climate change, acidification, and other impacts associated with emissions to air, water, and soil. So we finally got to our results. Really key part of LCA is that interpretation phase. So we want to highlight where those significant contributions to the various impact categories occur through the life cycle of that product. But it's also really important to understand any potential limitations of those results, whether it's via assumptions that have had to be made or whether it's through the data quality requirements of that LCA phase. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. These four phases are iterative in nature. So as you go through the project, they work hand in hand and can be updated accordingly as new information or methodologies come to light or need to be adapted. But again, the LCA practitioner will guide you through that process and deliver these phases. Final slide on how to conduct an LCA. I just wanted to highlight some of the key principles that not just for the ISO standards, but for anybody doing an LCA should really align to. And number one is the transparency aspect of an LCA. You really want to document your understanding of why you're delivering this LCA, the choice of methods that have been done, the advantages and disadvantages of making those assumptions and choices, but also any limitations of the process and data that have been collected. Life cycle assessment as a comprehensive methodology therefore requires quite a level of completeness around that system modelling, and therefore leads to quite a high level of scientific robustness required and consistency of methods and databases used through that project. Sensitivity and scenario analysis is one of the key features of an LCA. And that's because this is where we can then start to explore those environmental impact changes and reductions that we might want to try and achieve in the future. It's also where we start to look at some of the uncertainties in the project. And again, this is related around to that transparency aspect of any LCA. We want to show that we understand no LCA is perfect. There's going to be some uncertainties, and therefore it's important to show how those uncertain input-output parameters or methodological choices can affect the final environmental impact for that product or service. That interpretation section is therefore key to document that understanding of those overall environmental impacts, but also those limitations of that study. Just one note here on critical review. Depending on how you want to use the study, whether it's for internal or external purposes, there are requirements around third-party critical review. Essentially, if you want to publish your results or report in the public domain, put it on your website, use it for marketing material, then you need a third-party critical review. So there are challenges within LCA methodology, and actually quite furious debates within the community on some of the correct or incorrect methods that are seen across the LCA spectrum. Again, I could go into each of these points in a lot of detail, but essentially here it's the job of the LCA practitioner to help guide you through these challenges and help be transparent in that reporting aspects on the choices that have been made. So for example, data quality. How representative is the data for the system that you're trying to model, and therefore how representative is that environmental impact? And I've already touched on sensitivity and scenario analysis as a key feature to help in that regard. Standards. The ISO standards are not specific to any one material or sector, and therefore there are quite a considerable amount of options open to the practitioner on how to complete that study. But again, I relate you back to that transparency aspect in documenting those choices and the overall effect on the environmental impact. One example is one methodology called allocation, which you may or may not have heard of. And this relates to the figure on the right-hand side. So it's the method to partition the inputs and outputs and the environmental impact to different products that are produced from a single unit process. I just wanted to highlight there are a number of different methods for do this, advantages and disadvantages depending on the objectives of the study, which again should be documented by the LCA practitioner. Communication of other impact categories can be difficult outside of climate change, and again, the LCA practitioner will help show the relevance and significance of those impact categories. Put a little asterisk here against AI, because AI can be a great tool to support an LCA practitioner, especially around saving some time for the overall study and therefore cost to the commissioner. But you do have to be careful because AI doesn't always necessarily have the background documentation and transparency aligned to the LCA that you're trying to conduct. So AI will never replace an LCA practitioner, but it can be a supporting tool to help save a bit of time through that process. Talking of cost, traditionally, LCAs can range in cost depending on the objectives and complexity of the study, and I'll touch on this later. But hopefully, consultancies are now bringing down those barriers to allow LCA to be used as a tool among a whole spectrum of different companies. Having talked about those challenges and those debates that are still ongoing within the community. I can't take credit for this, but I like to see LCA as a tool for change. If you want to understand and reduce your environmental impact, LCA can be that powerful tool. We can use AI and digital tools to help in that assessment. We can align other social assessments and economic methodologies and bring those into environmental LCA as well. It can really help in that understanding around a more circular economy, moving away from a linear economy. And I have touched on regulations a little bit. I just wanted to highlight, even now, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, DESNZ, have an open consultation, a policy framework to grow the market for low carbon industrial products. Behind this consultation, they are talking about embedding LCA and EPDs within UK markets to help consumers understand the environmental impact of products and materials. And it's not just in the UK, as I've said here at the bottom of this slide, LCA is increasingly being embedded in regulations and other standards, and it is used as that strategic tool to meet organisational sustainability goals. So final few slides just on key considerations, timescales and pricing. If a client approaches us, they think they want to do an LCA, but it's a very new area to them, then we'll have a discussion around these key aspects and the products and services that they want to model. Whether they want to do a product carbon footprint or LCA, how many products they want to include in a study, especially if they're modular or very similar processes used to produce those products, then savings can be made by grouping those in the same LCA. I've already touched on how you want to use the results, whether that's for internal or external purposes, can have an effect on whether you then need that third-party review. Cradle to gate or cradle to grave, or whether you want to go to the extreme end of doing a full comparative LCA with a competing product and making public claims about that. Some other things that we need to consider, such as the bill of materials, how many other stakeholders are involved, the complexity of the system, and also what standards we may want to use. And we can guide throughout all of these key considerations as well, and give you advice on what we think is the most cost-effective approach for your overall objectives. Talking of pricing, first thing I did when I was putting these slides together, I asked ChatGPT, what is the typical cost of an LCA in the UK market? You can see on the right-hand side here, it's broken it down in terms of a number of different products, which I'll explain a bit in a minute. And you can see there is a huge range of costs, from what we call basic or streamlined LCA, they given a cost of 4 to 12 grand, up to full ISO compliant LCA 42 to 80,000. These costs I think are quite ludicrous. You can absolutely deliver a fully ISO compliant LCA for a fraction of that price. And again, just referring to my comments before around data source, it didn't actually say where this information came from. So I'll take it with a pinch of salt. But I have worked across projects on the full spectrum, whether it's multi-year, multi-stakeholder, complex systems, more to your everyday basic and fully ISO compliant LCAs for single products. Just to bring it a bit more back to reality, if you have a look in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see there was a survey done in 2017 on the cost of LCAs. According, taking inflation into account, that gave a range of 8 to 24k. Now, at Positive Planet, again, we have a number of products that we offer, from a streamlined ISO LCA up to the full comparative ISO compliant LCA. And again, there is a range, but just to give you an idea of those costs, you can see there in those bullet points on the left-hand side. I'm not going to go through all the text here. This is really for informative purposes. Afterwards, if you want to have a look in a little bit more details about how an LCA project is structured, then you can see those major stages from goal and scope definition all the way to final reporting. Typically, you can give a 3-month window for a streamlined LCA, and that can be extended up to 6 months if you then need to include critical reviews or a 3-panel critical review. Final slide from me. Hopefully you found this information useful and you want to take the next steps. If you do want to conduct a PCF or LCA, I haven't touched on EPDs because that deserves its own space and there will be a future webinar on that. We can discuss specifics about your product or service and the study scope. And to do that, you can feel free to book in a call with me here. So you can access my schedule for August in that QR code on the right-hand side. Please feel free to book in a free 30-minute consultation. We'll go through some of those key considerations and talk about your overall objectives, the product and the service that you want to model. And then we'll start to refine that down into a more detailed study scope. That will give us enough information to provide you with more detailed timescales. And again, we are quite flexible if you have a certain deadlines to work to, and also provide those pricing options. So I am on LinkedIn and there's a link there to my profile, and also I've provided my email. If you do want to get in touch with me directly, please feel free. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to Bryony.
Thank you, Michael. That's all been really interesting. You have had a question on EPDs though, so I think it will be interesting to go into that. I did try to answer it a little bit in the chat, but Lucia asked what was the difference between LCA and EPDs? Yeah,
so you can think of an EPD as an LCA that is verified, and then the EPD document takes the key aspects of that LCA and publishes it in a short form document. So an EPD is an LCA, but you take out the core elements and then you publish that online. Now you conduct the LCA to a stricter set of rules, which are called product category rules. Now people that do the LCA according to the same set of product category rules and then publish that EPD, you can then compare the information within those EPDs within that same set of product category rules. So it's the industry has brought this together as a way to compare similar products within those categories without having to do a full comparative LCA. I hope that answers that question. But again, EPDs deserve its own space, and I'll be doing a webinar on EPD in the near future, which will give a lot more information.
Thank you, Michael. So it's an addition to an LCA, and
yes,
more costly.
Yeah, it's an additional document that's publishable within a set of specific product category rules. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. So one other question, you mentioned critical reviews. Can you do critical reviews for externally completed studies? How does that all work?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, for LCAs that are to be published externally, then you need an independent third-party review. So if somebody else has done the LCA, I can do a critical review. I've been through many critical review processes myself. I've had single review of my studies, but I've also been through full 3-member panel reviews for comparative assessments that have been published as well. So I'm well experienced with critical reviews, and also at Positive Planet we can actually deliver that critical review service as well.
Great, thank you very much. And are you aware of any sector or material specific LCA methods?
Yes, so as I mentioned, the ISO standards are not specific to any one sector or material, and therefore some sectors and companies have taken it on themselves to embed LCA methods within their supply chain. So for example, I know automotive OEMs who ask their supply chain to provide environmental information to their own LCA methods. But there are also more public standards like the Product Environmental Footprint methodology by the EU Commission. There are subsets of that within different sectors like textiles. As I've just mentioned with EPDs, there's a number of different product category rules that set those stricter LCA methods dependent on that product category. So yes, there are different ways to approach specific materials and products. Again, all dependent on the goal and scope of the study and objectives for the commissioner.
And for people who are coming to this completely sort of blind, it's a new thing for them. What sort of output are they looking for? How long is a typical LCA, if there is such a thing?
In terms of a deliverable, so the actual output itself, it's typically a report. And again, if we break this down into those 3 different LCA categories, say a streamlined ISO LCA report can be anywhere from 25 to 40 pages roughly. If you then go up a step to a fully ISO compliant LCA that's to be published externally, you might be around the 50 to 60 page mark. For full comparative LCAs, where you're comparing one product system to another product system, you could expect that assessment to be somewhere in the order of 75 to even 150 pages, depending on the amount of additional sensitivity and scenario analysis required to fulfill the requirements for ISO for those comparative systems. So a whole range of reporting structures there, but usually have supplementary material as well, which really brings the key aspects of those studies together.
Great, thank you. And where do you see LCA sort of evolving in the next few years? Do we think there's going to be more requests for LCAs or EPDs potentially? I
think we're definitely seeing more and more people think they need to do EPDs or are being asked for EPDs. And again, that's quite sector specific. So construction have been using EPDs for many, many years, and that's quite commonplace there. But some other sectors are starting to take up the use of EPDs. So it might be that in sectors outside of construction, automotive, packaging, textiles, then EPDs or other similar programs with product category rules might be coming to the fore. But I think in general, LCA as a methodology, as I mentioned a couple of times, is more and more being embedded within regulations, even though it's not apparent at first that you might need to do an LCA for that environmental information. I think it is definitely becoming more and more incorporated into those standards and regulations. So I think starting to do it now will definitely help get companies in that mindset of what they need to do to fulfill those requirements.
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing it in a lot of our sectors, aren't we? We're working with a lot of public sector clients, for example, that are needing to supply into NHS and other areas, and they're starting to see something similar being requested, although we don't have the exact definition of those requests at the moment, but certainly within the next couple of years. Final question then, I think. What are the common pitfalls that you face or that you see clients face when they're approaching LCAs or EPDs? I
think I mentioned the most time-consuming part of an LCA is the data collection. And I've had it for years and years and years where we explain the necessary data, input and output information that we require across that process flow. And a lot of clients say, "Oh, great, yeah, we've got a lot of that. That's fantastic. We can go away and get that in a week or so." And lo and behold, actually collecting that data is actually quite difficult. And that's where we can come in again to help support that data collection period. And that's why we give quite a long time for that data collection, is to give a full window in order to collect as much information, primary information, as we can, supported by any background data where necessary. So I would say data collection is one of the most, not difficult, but time-consuming aspects of an LCA, definitely, yeah.
And I think that's similar across the board. So if you have done any sort of carbon measurement previously with us or anyone, it is that data collection bit that needs to be, really firmed up, planned into the way you work as an organisation to really make that more efficient year on year, or as you're developing out products, to make that all a lot easier a lot less of a headache when you're collecting that data. So I think that's all we have for today. So thank you everyone for your questions. If we weren't able to cover yours, or if you do think of something once you leave the webinar, please do email us. We'll answer anything via email, or as Michael suggested, you can book in a session with him. We have episode 2, our Smart ESG webinar, taking place on the 13th of August, which will cover how digital tools can make ESG reporting and sustainability strategies simpler, more effective, with practical ways to streamline your ESG processes. We'll also in that session be covering an introduction to double materiality with our ESG expert, Emma Gray, and Michael Slinkert from Every, our partner organisation. So do please sign up via the QR code on the screen now, and remember to look out for the other webinars in the series on LinkedIn. We will be adding that EPD session on as well that I've mentioned previously. So share with colleagues or peers that might be interested. But thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everyone for sharing your time with us today, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Bryony. Thanks, everybody.